Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of Seriously Risky Business. This is the podcast we do here at Risky Biz, where I speak with Tom Uren, who is our public policy and intelligence editor here at Risky Business, and we talk through the work that he's done on his newsletter through the week. This work is supported by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the fine people over at Lawfare Media. And we also have a sponsor this week, which is Sublime Security, great company that does email security. Think of it as like, a traditional cloud-based email security provider, although you can run it on-prem as well. But it's more configurable. You can sort of pop it open, write your own detections and things like that. Or you can just use it with its default settings or whatnot. But yeah, Sublime Security, fantastic company. So big thanks to them for supporting this podcast. Tom Uren, good to see you. How's it going?
G'day, Pat. How are you?
Good. So we've just been over your newsletter, which is just about to go out, the Seriously Risky Business newsletter, which of course is available at news.risky.biz. And you've written up two main items this week. Let's start with the first one, which is the three I's in spyware, which the three I's apparently are Israel, India, and Italy. There's a report from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, which looks at some of the key players in the spyware industry, and there's some interesting findings and diagrams and spider charts and whatnot in that in that report.
Yeah, that's right. It's always good to have a chart that looks good.
Yeah, you've always got to have like something that looks like a madman in front of a corkboard with some red string put together, which is what these are. But yeah,
accomplishment unlocked for that report. So the way they did this is that they basically spied it out from public reports of spyware vendors and developed links based on things like corporate registries and databases. And they came up with basically 6 take-home messages, and I won't go through all of them, but the one that stuck out to me is just concentration. So one was the concentration you spoke of, that there are these geographic clusters where there's lots of vendors and lots of entities that are related to spyware companies, so suppliers and resellers, Israel, India, and Italy. And that's also reflected in that there's a lot of individuals who go on from spyware company to found a spyware company to perhaps found another spyware company. And so it's actually a relatively small talent pool. And at least in terms of what I would call abusive spyware that's used in a way that's counter to human rights. Now, one of the things I like about the report is that it acknowledges that it's a dual-use technology. And so it's not, here's a report to try and destroy the spyware industry. It's, here's a report that tries to make it clearer what is going on and try and tease out what are the actual problems and what are the ways that we could address what's going on and try and make the industry better. So it's it doesn't feel like an advocacy piece at all.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like activism. It's more like, here's some charts that show you the connections between investors and some of the directors and various research companies and stuff, and this is what it looks like. So it is a little bit more mature than something that's seeking to, death to the entire spyware industry. Although, death to the entire human rights abusing spyware industry sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess it's a nuanced discussion. So in some of the other documents I've seen, so there's this thing called the Pall Mall process, which has been driven by France and the UK. And there's this disconnect between some of the language people in that process use. So the governments generally have this spyware is a dual-use product. We want to keep the good, minimize the bad. And other participants, usually companies, spyware is just terrible and it has no good use at all. So I think it's interesting that this report is quite measured. It also found things like companies will change their names multiple times. And the idea there is obviously once you get a bad reputation for doing some bad stuff, let's burn all the evidence and move on and reinvigorate ourselves like a phoenix. So the thrust of the recommendations is really about transparency. So if we don't want you to change your name so you look like a brand new, fresh angelic, yet to be tarnished spyware company. We want your history to be traceable so that
I think this sort of work shows that, changing your name doesn't really get you in the clear as well. But there was something I mentioned to you before we got recording, and it's just, I think this is worth mentioning, which is when I look at this research, when you look at the concentration of talent and the fact that you've got a lot of, a bunch of key people, a couple dozen key people who just pop up everywhere in these org charts or these spider charts, right? And then you've got them changing their names and doing rebrands and stuff.
Yeah.
Right? There's another thing that we track, that we look at, where it's very, very similar, and that's ransomware. Where you've got, a couple dozen of the people who are responsible for most of the action, in ransomware. They are always rebranding, reforming, and doing that sort of stuff. I just find it fascinating that we've got this industry, and of course we are, zeroing in on the uglier part of this business, which is the companies that are more likely to be selling their tools to countries that are going to use it to further human rights abuses. But it's interesting, isn't it, that they organizationally kind of resemble a criminal group in terms of the way that they function. I'm not calling them criminals. I don't want to get sued, right? But you get what I mean. Like, organizationally, it looks like the cybercrime underground.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is that the natural responses to government pressure are the same, and that they're to operate in jurisdictions that are more amenable, and so that's why you get a concentration. For whatever reason, I don't know that it's the same kind of amenable as ransomware in Russia.
No, but perhaps it could be that the authorities just haven't got around to it. In those countries and whatnot. Yeah. No, and I wouldn't have thought about it that way. That's really interesting, Tom.
And then also it's the changing names is the same thing. You're just trying to avoid attention.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's not one of the recommendations, but the report does point out that Italy is in the formal process, which is the process to try and crack down on abusive spyware, but India and Israel aren't. So there's other recommendations which are all about export control and licensing and having better information in corporate databases that all aim at transparency, that try and make it harder for companies and the individuals involved to sort of play the shell game, and therefore give them greater incentives to just behave better. Now, I thought they were modest recommendations, but also realistic ones, because they don't require... they're things that seemed like they were achievable, and they don't require something that would try and ban a whole... is it a whole industry? Some of which
category?
is
I don't know. Yeah, I know what you mean, though. Yeah.
Yeah, so overall I liked it.
Yeah. No, it was. It's interesting stuff. The other thing that you looked at this week, funnily enough, because we didn't talk before you put this one together, you actually wound up doing like the same analysis as Adam and I for the main show, kind of in parallel, right? And this happens sometimes, and I always find it like really validating when I've arrived at a conclusion and then like a day later you say the same thing independently of us having talked about it. And that's what's happened here, which is that last week when we saw, this huge raft of US government actions targeting Russian disinformation campaigns in the United States that are looking to influence the election and sow discord and all of that sort of stuff. The media focus was very much on, oh my God, Tim Pool was, taking money indirectly from the Russian government to say that Ukraine is bad. And, fair enough that got all of the attention, but it kind of did miss the point that there was a lot more than just the Tenet Media stuff in this action. And you have drilled into this more. I mean, Catalin Kimpanu, our colleague, did what I think, in terms of like just a news write-up on what happened and the action. Like, I think he did the best job you can find anywhere in the media, which is, I don't know. I mean, it's great for us, but it's kind of bizarre that he did the best report considering we're a, micro publication based out of Australia. But anyway, I digress. We spoke about it yesterday. Adam and I spoke about it, but now you've dived into some of the details and broadly you arrived at the same place that we did, which is, this isn't just about a bunch of right-wing YouTubers being paid by RT through some cutout to further drama. But you've looked at how, what's the best way to put this? Like, you've looked at how, DOJ now is doing things differently. Some of the platforms now are doing things differently, and it ain't 2016, right? We've got a situation where the US government is actually doing a robust response to this sort of stuff, and in particular, you've called out the fact that Meta was able to counter a lot of this stuff quite effectively. But just walk us through your take on all of this, Tom.
Yeah. So what I thought was really interesting is that we've gone from people in the disinformation community knowing for a long time that there's this process where ideas or narratives or conspiracy theories get seeded in all these random websites. Then they get amplified and picked up, and then Russian state media will talk about them, and then they sort of break through to the US political discourse. And that's a well-trodden path, but what really struck me is, like, all of a sudden the US government has come out and said, at this point it's connected to the US president. At this point it's connected to RT. RT is also connected to the FSB. This point is also connected to the FSB. So it said at every layer of that architecture, there's a direct link to the Russian government.
Yeah, so it's different, isn't it, to saying this has Russian government disinformation vibes.
Yeah.
Right? We saw how that played out with the Hunter Biden laptop, where, there was no link really ever shown. So for them to come out and say this, they kind of need to do that attribution, right? They need to cross their T's and dot their I's, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah, I thought that was just really interesting, given that it's it's a known phenomena for a long time, but all of a sudden, overnight, it's gone to, yes, here are the links. And so the other part that I found really interesting is that there's this shift in tactics. So in 2016, it was everything on social media. Not everything on social media. There was a lot of other things going on, but the
social media stuff was a core part of it, and also other services like WikiLeaks and whatnot. It was really they were trying to drive it from the online netizens bottom up approach. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
So in this case, what we see is that it's almost as if to an extent they're avoiding social media. So part of the way that they seed the campaign is through Doppelganger. That doesn't rely on social media so much. It still does, though. They still have to do some seeding of content. So with Doppelganger, they'll post an article on a fake news website. Then they do some basic seeding on social media, but then they get the other sites, the other fake news sites, to sort of build it up, and eventually it sort of gets an escape velocity and winds up being retweeted or whatever by legitimate accounts. So there still is a social media dynamic, but I understand what you mean is it's not about like giant networks of Twitter bots anymore. Yeah. And it's not about Facebook groups. And so there's actually a document that is from the companies behind the Doppelganger effort, and they talk about Meta, it's difficult. They're in bed with the NSA.
Yeah, right.
But Twitter, we can still make ground on Twitter.
Yeah.
So I guess the landscape has changed in terms of social media. At least Meta is taking steps. Twitter, fewer steps. And so the employment of influencers, I think, is a natural step.
Well, and indeed, you wrote a few weeks ago that increasingly Russia was embracing sort of commercial services. We didn't necessarily expect that to be high-profile talking heads.
No, that's right.
But yeah, they are where they can. They're just buying this stuff. I mean, as for Twitter too, like, okay, great, you're going to get your content out there. It might get engagement. But Twitter's such a mess in terms of the type of information that's there now. I mean, it really is just getting more and more 4chan. It's crazy, like how messy it is. It's just digital slop. I kind of stick around there just out of morbid fascination. It's like watching a car crash. I can't look away. But it's bad. Hey, another thing that you've got in this week's newsletter, and, for people who want to get Tom's complete thoughts on all of this, as I say, news.risky.biz, go subscribe to the newsletter. But you put one thing, and I thought it was curious that you put it in the reasons to be cheerful, which is CISA is no longer going to flag misleading election information to social media platforms for moderation or removal. Now, it was always very controversial that CISA was doing this. Why is it a reason to be cheerful? I'm just curious why you put it there. Is it just because you couldn't find another thing to put in reasons to be cheerful?
Well, that's partly the answer, but also partly, I think it is a good move to step away from it because it was so politically controversial.
Yeah.
So here in Australia, we have an independent body, the Australian Electoral Commission, and they will tackle election-related disinformation or misinformation. I'm not sure if they would approach the platforms, though, and it seems like if you can come out with a clear message that, and they were very narrow in their interpretation, the AEC, the time, the date, how you vote, the ways you can vote. Like, these are all, like, known facts.
What they consider disinformation is, very narrow.
Yeah, that the AEC is actually responsible for. They're the body that can issue the authoritative guidance. And they will go and tackle that. I don't know, like I said, if they'll talk to platforms about it. So it seemed to me that there is a role for an election body to do that. But if it's more political...
it's more trouble than it's worth. I get it.
It's not worth it. Then
I 100% get what you mean. I think there's been a successful campaign to sort of poison DHS doing that.
But
it does sound scary, right? When you got like the Department of Homeland Security involved in,
telling you how to
providing lists of content for slow It's just,
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now I understand why that's in reasons to be cheerful.
Like I said, plus it was a slow, happy week.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it?
Well, actually, there was other stuff that I referenced that Catalan wrote about that was good news, but he did such a good job, I couldn't sort of just shove it up in there. And
couldn't cut and paste it.
That's right, yeah.
From him. But yeah, look, as I say, everyone can head over to news.risky.biz and have a look at Tom's newsletter here. You can read it on that site, or you can subscribe to it as a newsletter. Fascinating stuff as always, mate. And great work, and look forward to chatting to you again next week.
Thanks, Patrick.